So in the last month, there's been an enormous row brewing in the UK about anti-Semitism and the Labour Party, and from the most conservative and establishment elements of the Jewish community, and from the right of the Labour Party, there has been an attack on the Corbyn project, with the claim that Corbyn himself and his followers, and possibly the Labour Party as a whole, is anti-Semitic or is totally riddled with anti-Semitism. And this has particularly polarised in the last couple of months, in a struggle about whether or not the Labour Party is going to adopt a certain definition of anti-Semitism called the IHRA definition. And for those who are attacking Corbyn, the claim is that this definition is a sort of hallmark of good politics that would oppose anti-Semitism and would put an end to the dangers that they claim that Jews face. And on the other side are a set of concerns about what implementing this definition might, how it might limit expression, and how it might limit claims, for example, by Palestinians that the ethnic cleansing that has happened to them and continues to happen to them is a result of the Israeli state's racism. I'm of the view that definitions probably aren't hallmarks of good anti-racist politics, and that they're not particularly useful as a tool in fighting anti-Semitism. And I suspect quite strongly that underlying this division is an unasked question, or a question which neither side wants to answer so explicitly. And so I'm going to attempt just to say something about what might be going on beneath this, and how we ought to think about anti-Semitism in the current context, and to place that in some short historical view. The study of anti-Semitism has a relatively short history. It is the first books on anti-Semitism are really written in the first decades of the 20th century, and the first advanced theories on anti-Semitism arise in the 30s and 40s, and they range variously from historical studies on anti-Semitism to a real interest in psychoanalytic explanations for anti-Semitism that came to the fore in the late 30s and 40s in particular, to explain the violent and statewide anti-Semitism of Nazism, and very quickly these psychoanalytic theories turn into theories of anti-Semitic character, or of characterologies of who anti-Semites are. But it strikes me that despite all of this history, the current debate about where anti-Semitism comes from is split broadly along the lines of this debate that's happening in the Labour Party, and I take it that there's a relatively serious disagreement between the two sides, and it's worth maybe fleshing them out. On the one side, on the left, there is probably broadly what would be considered quite an old-fashioned account of anti-Semitism, which is to say that anti-Semitism arises most prominently as a result of bourgeois society and of capitalism, and it arises in a number of different ways, and so sometimes it might come from the bourgeoisie themselves, who are concerned about an underground Jewish influence, who might want to overthrow society with Bolshevism, or at other points it might occur out of the contradictions and strains of capitalism, when people who are very oppressed by that social system want to find either an explanation for why they're oppressed, or an attempt to understand a society that seems to them like nothing but perennial suffering, and in doing so they leap to an explanation that says society is bad because it is run by malevolent forces, or a group of people, a group of Jews or Jewish interests who want to keep them as non-Jews under control, and they do that through maintaining capitalism. And it's a sort of very brief definition of a sort of social account of where anti-Semitism comes from, and what might be interesting about that description is that it there might be something about what capitalism is like and the ideologies that produce it that also lead a great many people into anti-Semitic thinking. Well, it might be something inherent about bourgeois society that it produces also the Jew as a scapegoat figure. And so this is something like a social, an explanation of anti-Semitism as socially produced. And it arises out of the mode of social production. And against this, from the right, is probably a much more recent account of where anti-Semitism comes from, which, instead of wanting to see it as socially produced, sees it and seeing it as arising out of the processes of society and the ideologies that society produce, instead wants to view anti-Semitism as arising out of strife between communities, or as a result of what has been called the failure of multiculturalism, or in like global terms as a result of clash of civilizations, and the sort of quiet implication behind all of these sort of communalist versions of where to the answer of where anti-Semitism comes from is that anti-Semitism probably comes from Muslims, and it seems to me that beneath a lot of the claims of the right is this idea that modern anti-Semitism, at least in the last 20 years or so, arises out of a clash of communities, and so this version of thinking, it certainly has its has an easier set of people to blame for anti-Semitism, and an easier set of targets than the social explanations. So alongside the development of this, the new sort of communalist theories of anti-Semitism is a hypothesis that arises, and it arises first as a product of elements of the Israeli state itself, but it comes to real prominence in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which is called the new anti-Semitism. And the claim of this hypothesis is that all of the bigotry and hatred that had previously existed against Jews, and which might have been targeted against Jews as individuals or Jews in society or Jewish communal institutions, have now migrated into an attack on Israel. And in some ways it's worth saying that there's quite a strict continuity between this account and a communalist rendering of the origins of anti-Semitism. And in this way, the Jewish community is attacked as a community, and in particular here as a nation, and therefore the sort of clash of communities or the blame of the Muslims for anti-Semitism migrates into a sort of a claim that anti-Semitism is generated out of the clash between Israel and Palestine, and that in some ways, like, one of the consequences of this type of thinking is to say that the Palestinians who are struggling for their emancipation and the right of return to their homeland are responsible for anti-Semitism on a global scale. So behind this is behind this thinking, there's also a set of historical conditions. The first of these is that it's clear that globally Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle for freedom and emancipation and for a homeland is supported by the left, and so one of the logics that cuts into this communalist explanation of anti-Semitism is to say that more broadly anti-Semitism is now a left-wing phenomenon, and that anti-Semitism is associated not only with decolonial politics, but also with anti-American politics or anti-globalist politics. And so the accusation of anti-Semitism as a result of left-wing support for Palestinian emancipation, this accusation belongs to the right under the figure of the new anti-Semitism. At the same time, there's a set of much broader global historical conditions that lead into this, and there on the one hand, the fact that Israel as a society has become much more theologically inclined, religious and fundamentalist in character, and that in particular in the last sort of 30 to 40 years, there's been a very strong rightward warmongering trend in Israeli politics. And one of the things about this shift in Israeli politics and Israeli Zionism is that it has, since the late 1990s and the early 2000s, acted in concert with the war on terror, and so the sort of war on terror idea that the Muslims are to blame or are to be killed, and this has come into very close contact with new right-wing and fundamentalist forms of Zionism. At the same time, there's been a sort of set of changes that have happened in West European and in the States and in the US, in which there was, as a result of the reorganization of society in one way or another, a shift towards multiculturalism in the 80s and 90s, and this led to sort of all sorts of new types of communitarianism, many of which were adopted by mainstream Jews and right-wing Jews as well, as a means by which they could assimilate, but assimilate not in a way that meant giving up their Jewishness, but in the sort of looseness of politics in the multicultural era of the 80s and 90s, there seemed to be a possibility of a sort of small state patriotism, and in which the state would recognise communities and would bolster, especially community leaders, and the sort of firmness of those communities. And that multicultural politics basically falls apart with the war on terror and the sort of sudden belief in this by the state that it needs to, in particular, start implementing a much more serious set of controls on Muslims domestically, as well as internationally, and so you get new terrorism laws and new migration laws and new forms of policing and enforcement, and but in some ways, out of this, the possibility of a sort of patriotic and communal Jewishness, which is aligned now with a right-wing Israeli state that is, acting in concert with the war on terror, manages to maintain itself and, in some ways, becomes more patriotic. And there's an attempt by the so-called community leaders to drag the Jews of Britain towards a position in which their patriotism means support for an ever more violent and ever more fundamentalist and ever more warlike Israeli state, and towards a set of government policies in which anti-Semitism can only be understood in terms of intercommunal strife or the breakdown of this multiculturalism, and in which the threat against the West that is supposed as the basis of the war on terror also becomes the threat against European Jewry and American Jewry as well. So how does the IHRA fit into all of this? Well, the IHRA definition is it's a definition that comes precisely out of those first few years of the war on terror, and it adopts the new anti-Semitism hypothesis absolutely. And it's worth saying here that there's an attempt to in this definition to draw together all of this politics that's both global and local, and to in some ways by stealth give a new answer to the question of where anti-Semitism comes from, and although the definition does in many ways account for this older, more left-wing account of socially produced anti-Semitism, its main focus is certainly on an understanding of the breakdown of multiculturalism. One of the other things that has happened in that time is there's been probably quite a large shift in anti-racist politics, and one of the most concerning aspects of this is that instead of building large movements to oppose racism, and in fact to oppose all sorts of other kinds of oppression from the 1980s onwards, as this new communalist politics takes hold more broadly in European societies, there's been a sense that oppression, the best defense against oppression is a sort of scandalizing response, which says that it's simply outrageous for anyone to say anything or do anything that undermines the like peaceful and pluralist nature of society. And in many ways, this scandalizing response is inadequate, and I think in many ways also the politics of people engaged in multicultural politics or cultural studies in the 1980s and 1990s was at times a little naive about the belief that racism could be challenged in this way, and the belief that, for example, teaching everyone in school that racism is a bad thing would be adequate to deal with racisms that are like socially produced. It's certainly not the case that that this has had any great effect in either making populations more anti-racist or in making countries or institutions more anti-racist. And so I think we need to think about a different standpoint. But it's also it's one of the consequences of this sort of scandalizing response to anti-Semitism, scandalizing response to racism and to anti-Semitism is that one can start to build a belief that making the right definition of racism is adequate to challenge it, and as long as everyone knows what the definition is, then it will be clear who has crossed that line, and then we can scandalize them, rather than understanding that ideology is like an element of like how society produces itself. And so I think that the idea that a definition is a good is a good tool of anti-racism comes out of this quite problematic understanding of of how racism really does need to be opposed. And so, for that reason, I would encourage people to oppose the IHRA definition. I think that these sort of communalist explanations of anti-Semitism, which are a sort of short cover for claiming that anti-Semitism is the fault of the Muslims, and in turn that it's the fault of the Muslims for precisely the same reasons that Western European states, Britain and America, justified bombing all parts of the Middle East and Afghanistan about 15 years ago. These are quite bad arguments, and I think people who want to oppose anti-Semitism shouldn't so easily be drawn into them. I think we can be perfectly good. We can have perfectly good resistance to racism without definitions, but what is required is education. But this will also require us to have this conversation about where we think anti-Semitism comes from, and it will require us to have a real political fight and to say, well, anti-Semitism results from it arises in bourgeois society or capitalist society as a result of like mainly of total hopelessness that anything can change, and conspiracy theories become common amongst people who feel that they have no political agency, and who feel like all that the society offers them is suffering. And so we're going to have a fight and say, well, actually, in our analysis, modern anti-Semitism isn't a result of two communities that can't get on. It's not, and it's certainly not because we believe that Muslims are simply barbarians, and this is a very poor explanation for certainly the anti-Semitism that exists in Great Britain, but also anti-Semitism globally. And I don't think we should, buy into this logic, which is only supported by the racist right. And it's also worth saying that the people who most avidly support it in the UK are also people who avidly supported the war on terror, and in particular, one can think of those people who are on the right of the Labour Party, Blairites, and people who are around the Euston Manifesto, who swung from sort of centre-ish left positions to being full-on Islamophobes and warmongers in the early to mid 2000s. But I think the question also remains open as to what education means, and there's a sense if we start education from a definition, then all we'll be teaching people is about what lines not to cross, and this seems to me totally inadequate as a mode of understanding how we should oppose anti-Semitism. And instead, I think that we should start from the position that there is anti-Semitism in society. We might be unsure of where it comes from. We might be unsure as to what it's going to do and how dangerous it might become, and that we should oppose it. But we also can't start from this scandalising perspective that says, well, you're an anti-Semite and therefore you simply have to be utterly silenced and excommunicated. I think we can have a conversation with people that shows them that their understanding of society leads to the oppression of Jews, and it leads them to leads to like real dangers for Jews, without simply scandalising that. And I think the notion that we can't begin conversations with anti-Semites is a scary one, even however much we oppose them and might be scared of them. And so if we start a process of education from the position that says, well, anti-Semitism is going to exist, and it's been produced in a whole variety of forms in the history of capitalism, and it might take certain forms now, and it might take other forms in a few years' time. Then maybe we can start to build a movement that can oppose it properly, and not just decide where the lines are drawn